I'm working on the field of quantifying what is a fair emissions target, and I'll be focusing here on this talk on more the applications of this scholarship to litigation cases, but it also it also informs UN negotiations, and then the narrative is a bit different on how to present the results. So here I'll be focusing on the relevance for court cases. So I think along the chain of attribution that litigation cases require, we've heard before how the science can inform the attribution of impact to climate change, then from climate change to human activities, and then attributing the responsibility of a specific actor's contribution to global warming, as Noah presented. What I'm working on specifically is the attribution to remedy. So the attribution to reduce emissions specifically for countries. So what can be asked of a country by a court? So first, I'll be presenting a little bit what the Paris Agreement, so as an international treaty, provides us, and what is the role of equity within the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, signed in 2015, set important global goals, so limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees and stay well below 2 degrees globally, and limits emissions to reach net zero in the second half of the century. So these are global goals, and it leaves open the questions of the specific contribution of each country to meet these global goals. But there is a principle of equity in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement that applies to the entire agreement, so mitigation, emissions reduction in particular, but the entire agreement itself. And so this Article 2 specifies that the Paris Agreement will be implemented to reflect equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances. So a lot of the science we produce was also framed by this legal document, and that results also from political decisions, but we try to shape science in order to inform how can countries individually contribute to do their fair share of the Paris Agreement, and we'll see why we're talking about fair shares. So under the UNFCCC, so the section of the UN on negotiating climate change, countries are requested to submit nationally determined contributions of the highest possible ambitions, which translate, amongst others, in emissions targets for 2030. These targets need to be improved periodically, and the goal of this iterative process is that there's an emulation across countries, and that we eventually reach global emissions levels that align in 2030 and later with the scientific necessity of emissions levels in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So there will be a global stocktake at the end of this year under the UN to take stock of where the world is in terms of emissions reduction and where are the gaps in terms of ambition in order to reach the Paris Agreement goals. Countries' nationally determined contributions, also called NDCs, have to indicate how they're fair and ambitious. And the terms fair and ambitious go hand in hand because fairness is the metric for ambition. It is not possible to assess the overall ambition of a country's contribution without taking into account its responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of its national circumstances, as was described in the Article 2. So in order to assess the ambition of a country, we have to look at the fairness of its contributions in light of those criteria. So for courts specifically, under the UN, there are discussions about pursuing fair outcomes. But for courts specifically, the relevance of equity is that it's the metric for ambition. And so it is what can be used to assess whether a country is doing enough or not to enable the pursuit of an agreement or of a global goal. This is a figure from the emissions gap report, which you can see here on the left. Is, I think, what's important to see is that the top blue line is where current policies are taking us, and it's somewhere around 2.8 degrees of global warming. If countries were to implement their current unconditional targets, we would reach 2.6 degrees of global warming at the end of the century. Should we reach the conditional indices, would go to 2.4. And basically, we can see the very important emissions gap towards putting the world on track for 1.5 degrees of global warming. So there is a very important mitigation gap. And the question that is to be addressed is also how much each country should reduce their emissions in order to close this gap. So it's important to see that the current pledges are collectively very insufficient, that they are leading to a dangerous global warming, and that obviously they are not consistent with the realization of the Paris Agreement. So the question is, what can scientists do in order to help informing courts maybe to close this gap? So we'll go into the scientific contributions we can do to inform these questions. I cannot tell what courts should be doing, but considering the science, I think, can help leading to decisions that help closing this gap. And I think while there can be some uncertainty or some divergence in the results of different studies, the absence of decision or the decision not to rely on any science is not neutrality, as it leads us to follow the blue curve at the top, which is where the current policies and the current status quo is leading us to. So yeah, the absence of decision is not a neutrality, and following some science is better than not ruling on any science at all, in my scientific opinion. A little bit of background on what we call the IPCC scenarios often. They were mentioned prior as SSP scenarios as well in the past. What is important to know about these scenarios? So, for instance, these can be either business as usual scenarios as the highest one, the C8 scenario you can see on that figure, or very ambitious scenarios that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, as we saw in the previous figure, or as you can see here as the C1 scenario. These scenarios are modeled to implement cost optimally mitigation worldwide. So that assumes that the cheapest mitigation option is achieved wherever it may be. So just based on this price, always the cheapest mitigation option. And that results in a geographical distribution of the mitigation effort that can put a lot of transformation in places where the emissions intensity is very high, meaning where the industry is not so efficient. So that tells what ideally, as in to reduce costs, what the transformation of the world would be to achieve this scenario. But it does not tell who should fund this emissions reduction, how much effort each country should provide in order to achieve that global transformation. Also, these scenarios do not factor climate impact. So in some cases, that's also something to consider. But these scenarios should not be used, or their geographical distribution should not be used to assess the ambition of a country. It simply informs the transformation that the world would see if we were to follow their modeling. So fairness and equity are not considered within these scenarios. And for instance, in the case of Norway's first nationally determined contributions prior to the Paris Agreement, they relied on the information from this socioeconomic scenario. And because the industry is relatively more efficient in Norway than in some other parts of the world, it resulted in having an emissions targets for Norway that is very unambitious and does not account for equity considerations, for its capabilities, for its responsibility. And so it just looked at, how much emissions reduction would happen in Norway under that cost-optimal global scenario. So what is what information do we have on effort sharing, on equity within the IPCC? In the fourth assessment report that came out in 2007, the literature on various approaches to equity, so various modeling of equity approaches, led to the synthesis box, so sort of summarizing a range of emissions reduction that would be appropriate for Annex 1 countries being also known as developed countries. So it recommended that by 2020, developed countries should reduce their emissions between 25 to 40%. And because this is based on a range of studies that each would work if they were applied to all countries, it may not work if each country is picking the least ambitious end of the range or the least ambitious of these different studies. So this box was useful in synthesizing the existing literature, and it gives us a useful range, but it also does not really work if every country is going to apply the least ambitious end of that range. So systematic court decisions that government must follow the least ambitious end of an equity range would be insufficient to achieve the global goal. Also, that was made for 2 degrees back then. In the 5th assessment report, there was more detail, and there was a breakdown of that range into several ranges, looking at several concepts of equity as modeled in the literature on distributive justice applied to climate considerations. So concepts of capability, of equality, of responsibility, and others were modeled. It does not mean that they're all complying with the Paris Agreement. Equality specifically is not referenced in the Paris Agreement as a criterion. So just it is modeled by some studies to model some concepts of distributive justice, but it does not necessarily mean that it's compliant with legal norms. So this provides more detail, and it enables to sort of pick the different equity concepts, and that might be helpful for scientists, but it's also maybe harder for read for non-experts or like from people who don't work in that scholarship. So decision makers, judges, NGOs, what is an appropriate targets, who gets to decide what is equitable within that range. And so here what we see is basically that for OECD countries, looking at different concepts of equity would lead to different emissions reduction in 2030 compared to 2010. So some being more stringent than others. What's interesting to see is that obviously relying on a concept rather than another would lead to different emissions targets, but none of them is aligned with the current business as usual scenario, which is the orange bar on the top right. So again, not taking a decision would lead us to that business as usual and would be inappropriate to consider to any of the metrics for ambition presented here. So this is the whole figure for different world regions. I'm not going into details here. Following this, there was a call by one of the lawyers of the Urgenda case showing the importance of having clear scientific quantifications also presented in IPCC reports in order to help non-experts of that field or like experts of other fields to rely on this on these results in order to inform court cases in this case, but it's also helpful for negotiations or legislative processes. So he said in this comment in, I think it was Nature, assessing fair share of reduction in the context of litigation is as much a legal issue as a scientific one, and legal scholars and scientists should cover it. What came out of it? Pretty much nothing. In the 6th assessment report, there is no quantification presented. There is no summary of the literature. Literature is mentioned and is acknowledged, and it does say that various assessment frameworks have been proposed to analyze the fair share ranges of NDCs, and many of these studies are quoted, but there is no range, no quantification put forward in the IPCC reports that could help litigation cases, partly because the IPCC also doesn't provide country-level information. So in the absence of that IPCC figure that would really suggest adequate emissions level for countries, we have to look at the existing studies individually. So I'll start to show briefly the studies that I've been working on myself, and then I'll open to other assessment frameworks that exist. This is just an example so you can visualize what we are trying to do. So if you look at a red line, which is the same in all of the graphs, this is a emissions pathway for the world to limit global warming to below 2 degrees. So you can see the emissions going up until a bit after, well, up until now, and then emissions reducing in the future. The question is how much each country gets out of that global amount of emissions at any point in time. And there are different ways of splitting this emissions trajectory across countries. So what I'm showing here with the different color patches is how this adds up across countries. So we're not using what we call emissions budget directly, which are just the integrated version of this over time. We're trying to really share dynamically over time at every point in time so that it exactly adds up to the 1.5 degree trajectory or 2 degree trajectory in order to be consistent with the global climate goal. So in the case of the study that we had published, this is an example of how you can see, for instance, for the European Union, where the current climate target lies. So the first climate target was the black dot. The turquoise one is the new climate target, 55% reduction. And you can see how it does not align with what would be fair emissions trajectories under the distributive justice, the equity criteria that we quantified. So here, for instance, we could say that the NDC, the climate targets of the European Union, is insufficient compared to these different modelings of equity. We can see, though, that if each country takes as a target the least stringent of those 4 lines, it wouldn't add up across countries because it wouldn't be the same line for all countries. So that led us to a second paper trying to look at this case. What would happen if each country picks the vision of equity that favors their narrative, so that they could claim that they're doing a fair share according to some vision of equity, or perhaps lead to a situation close to a replication of the litigation case of Urgenda, where each country picks the least ambitious end of a range based on several equity approaches or several scientific articles or several studies on the topic. So we quantified a scenario where, so this is a simplified schematic scheme to show what would happen, but basically if we have 2 countries, A and B, and country A has a greater allocation under the first equity approach and country B under the second, then each picks respectively approach 1 and 2, and then each country aims at 2 degree fairly according to some studies, and then that leads to, instead of reaching 2 degrees, that lead to a global warming of 2.5 degrees. So we did this for all countries with a range of equity principles that I presented before, and we showed that aiming in a self-interested manner at 2 degrees would lead to a global warming likely below 2.5 degrees, and aiming at 1.5 would reach 2.0 degrees. Interestingly, we could see that collectively, the first aggregation of emissions targets worldwide was lying somewhere in this range. So it doesn't mean that countries are exactly doing this situation, what is fair according to their own self-interest, but some are doing much more and some are doing less, but collectively we see that the world is matching this situation. And one of the comments that we made out of this situation was to say that systematic court decision that governments must follow the least ambitious end of an equity range would be insufficient to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and that was also mentioned in the application forum of the Portuguese youth case, as also an argument perhaps for going directly to the European Courts of Human Rights, because even winning a Urgenda type case in each country would still not add up. There is a need of consistency across the different countries, and so a self-interest-led vision of equity or application of the law, such as in the case of Urgenda, wouldn't lead to a global consistency with the Paris Agreement goals, or any global goal that is pursued. So we also quantified a way to combine different equity principles, trying to turn even dissonant equity metrics into an ambition metrics, and then as we did this, we are then equipped with ambition metric in terms of global warming. So we could say if the whole world followed the ambition of the European Union, we would get to a warming of 2.5 degrees. So it used to be 3.2, but now it's with the new targets, it's 2.5 degrees of global warming. So we have a metric, even in the absence of an agreement on a single approach of equity across countries, to assess the ambition of countries. So what's important to see here is that despite the dissonance that we can perceive from the literature, or the fact that there are different approaches of equity, there are still ways to tackle that question and to address the question as to whether or not a country is sufficiently ambitious. So that's the first range of climate targets that came out with the Paris Agreement. And the new targets are a bit better for a lot of countries. So like I said, the European Union is now at around 2.5 degrees of global warming according to the study. And so we will track also the ambition of the successive climate targets as they come out and as they are updated. But we can see that they're still very insufficient, which is unsurprising given the first graphs we saw on the trajectory of where the world is heading at. On that website and also in the you can see how the countries justify the ambition of their climate targets. So it's directly the text coming from their own climate targets. As I mentioned in the beginning, they have to explain how their NDC, their climate target, is fair and ambitious. Many countries do not provide any explanation here. For instance, the EU is providing some justification by saying that the world should reach net zero emissions in the second half of the century, and the EU is aiming at 2050. So it's sufficient, but there is no real framework explaining how this vision is replicable, how it can work worldwide, or how it fits in really a formula to assess the ambition of the EU or of different countries under the global goal and the Article 2, for instance, of the Paris Agreement in this case. So this kind of literature, so here is specifically the one I presented, but in general it feeds IPCC reports, UNEP, so UN reports assessing the ambition of different countries. It will also inform the global stocktake under the UN by the end of the year. Sometimes governments can use it, so the UK Committee on Climate Change uses some of our studies to justify the ambition of a climate target that was then taken by the British government. So it uses peer-reviewed literature, which is a good thing in itself, but then interprets the range still in a self-interested manner that is not replicable by other countries in order to guarantee a 1.5 degree alignment. So good to use peer-reviewed science, but the problem is also in the interpretation and that sort of self-interested narrative that other countries cannot follow. And so it doesn't really answer the question as to how it fits within a globally consistent narrative. So it can also be used by subnational targets in states and cities, although this literature needs to be extended. And it's also used to inform climate litigation cases. So here I'll just quote maybe briefly the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, once again stating that it is only in relation to such a fair share that the adequacy of a state's contribution can be assessed in the context of a globally collective action problem. So here I'll be talking a bit about the climate action tracker because that's what was used in the Portuguese youth climate case. So it's also trying to synthesize the existing literature, so different equity principles, different studies into a range of ambition segments in order to assess whether a country's climate target is in line with a 1.5 degree goal, or if it's only in line with a 2 degree warming, 3 degree, etc. So what you can see if you go on the climate action tracker is a composite index now. What matters to really assess the ambition of an emissions target, of an overall contribution to emissions reduction, is the fair share metrics. Climate finance can be a mean of implementation, same as domestic target. If we have time, I'll explain later. But basically, the fair share target can be met through a combination of international climate finance, so supporting emissions reduction beyond the borders of a country, but funded by that country, and domestic targets, so specifically reducing emissions within that country. I can't really see what's, oops. The other ones are, yeah, policy, so assessing not the climate targets itself, but how the policies are tracking to meet it. So that's not helpful for assessing the ambition of the targets itself. There are complicated graphs that provide a lot of detail, but here I'll only insist on the green circle. So to see the ambition of a climate target on the climate action tracker, it's the fair share that matters. And then there are sub-assessments of the domestic pathway or the climate finance components that the country is providing, and whether that's aligned with a cost-optimal implementation of the mitigation measures worldwide. So that's an option to be efficient globally, but what matters for the ambition assessment is really the fair share. And yeah, I'm just showing below that once again we can see different categories of equity, and that basically there's a statistical gathering to show different ranges of consistency with the literature, and it's trying to synthesize all of the literature basically, such as what we saw in the first quantification provided by the 4th and 5th assessment reports of the APCC. So maybe on how to meet those fair share ranges, because we might think, looking at this for the European Union, we can see that basically the EU should be close to net zero in 2030, and that may seem overly ambitious or maybe to some impossible to achieve, but I'll be commenting on how this is actually feasible through a combination of domestic mitigation and international climate finance. First, I'll talk about a very recent study. Actually, it came out in 2022, not 2023. But basically, it was looking at whether the climate finance globally provided by different countries was being fair, and also whether it was sufficient to fund the mitigation effort worldwide. So basically, the study looked and found that the climate mitigation finance provided by North Africa and European Union was very insufficient compared to what would be their fair share. And so this also highlights that the fair climate finance would be helpful to implement the IPCC scenarios because of the reasons that I mentioned before, which is that the cost-optimal implementation of mitigation efforts might induce a lot of transformation in countries that do not have the capital to do so. So it's not just about fairness, it's about really having sufficient ambition to meet the Paris Agreement goals and simply being able to fund the mitigation measures that are required in order to implement the 1.5 degree scenarios. So yeah, I'll conclude by showing how technically this can be envisaged. So socioeconomic scenarios, the IPCC scenarios, so to say, show what transformation should happen, where mitigation should happen, and equity scenarios, the ones that we looked into details, are telling how much each country should reduce emissions, how much effort they should provide. So if we look at a schematic case for developed countries, for instance, we have a more stringent, equitable scenario compared to what should happen domestically just in order to do a globally cost-optimal implementation of mitigation effort. So the difference, so the country that developed countries could implement domestically the blue curve to reduce its emissions along the blue curve and fund the emissions reduction that is the difference with the red curve, which is its equitable effort internationally. So it could purchase such mitigation outcomes or fund mitigation outcomes, as is now also framed with the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, to make sure that there are corresponding adjustments when a country funds mitigation effort in another country, that the total is really provided and there's no double counting. So we could, like that, see how much a given country should should contribute to global mitigation efforts beyond its domestic emissions reduction. And with the carbon price, the emissions reduction price that are inferred by the underlying scenario, we could also estimate the amount of finance that each country could provide for developed countries and likewise receive for a developing country. I will go very quickly over this, highlighting that some of the effort sharing, and I'm using the term effort sharing literature, so looking at how effort can be shared doesn't mean that it's necessarily equitable. And in some cases, scientists are modeling some effort sharing formula or some distribution, some formula to distribute the effort across countries that are not equitable, that are not aimed at being ambition metrics. And so these should not be mistaken, or this should not be used as ambition metrics. So it's also specified in the IPCC report. There was a recent article highlighting this in the context of international law and saying that, yeah, these approaches should not be part of an ambition assessment framework. And the last point is a study that is not peer-reviewed yet, but that was also commissioned by a group of 58 developing countries that wanted to model the application, the immediate application of what would be fair emission trajectories, and then they wouldn't have to necessarily start at current emissions levels, and instead we would see what should be equitable, adequate emissions levels now. And we can see that then to meet those emissions trajectory that are widely different from today's levels, that would imply having a lot of international climate finance and a lot of support that is crucial for a lot of countries to make sure that they don't follow the carbonated, the CO2 intensive development that a lot of other countries followed, and that makes possible the reaching the 1.5 degree goal. So yeah, these are the key messages. Equity is the metric for ambition. Not deciding on the basis of the literature itself is not neutral, and that's not specific message to courts. The possible inconsistency of the different metrics needs to be tackled and is also tackled in the literature, and literature on that topic also exists. Thank you.